Good morning, Pastor Ron Jetter, Immanuel Lutheran Church, Monday, the 10th of August, 2020. August already a third of the way over. Wow, summer almost in the books. People looking toward whatever school might look like. My own grandkids in Eugene will be learning online only for a while, until at least the first semester, it looks like, and it seems to be fairly typical. Here in Sunnyside, it's going to be the same way. Is God interested in justice or in morality? Or both, or neither? And who gets to define what justice is, or morality for that matter? It tends to vary from place to place and from time to time. Remember Huckleberry Finn? Great book, where Mark Twain lays out the perfect moral dilemma. Jim, an escaped slave traveling with Huck and Tom, or I guess at that point just with Huckleberry Finn, they're on a raft on the Mississippi River. Jim, a black man, has never learned to swim. He's never had that privilege. Huckleberry grew up around creeks and lakes and ponds and is quite a good swimmer. So when a riverboat comes along and knocks the raft apart, Jim is going under. Here's the moral dilemma. It is immoral for Huckleberry to risk his life as a white person to save the life of a black person. And Twain lays that out beautifully. And Huck solves the moral dilemma by doing not the moral thing, but the right thing, the just thing. He says, all right, so I go to hell for it. I'm saving my friend. And he does. That's perhaps what love really is. Doing the right thing, being willing to take the worst punishment God can dish out, but knowing that we've done what we believe is right. Trouble is, as Paul says in Romans 3, we don't have that assurance. As he says in 1 Corinthians 13, we see in a mirror dimly. We really never get the assurance that what we're doing is right. Rather, we try for the ethical solution, saying, from where I stand right now, this seems to be the best thing, the right thing. But we've seen the definition of justice changing in the last few months. And we're all wrestling and wondering, what now? What next? Good question. Now back to morality. Most of you are either in Grandview or Praso or elsewhere, but the city of Sunnyside, where I live, was founded by a group of people, bankers and a minister, in 1902, and there was a morality clause. People would be given land to farm and to settle and to put their businesses and their houses on if they signed the morality clause. There would be no drinking, there would be no carousing, there would be no gambling, there would be no houses of ill repute, there would be no dancing. These things were strictly forbidden by that early German Brethren colony. They wanted nothing to do with sin, and so they were able to live righteous lives. Other churches started up then. The Catholic Church, the Presbyterian Church, the Methodist Church, a number of churches. It became the holy city, more churches per capita than anywhere else in the state of Washington. Wow, Sunnyside, the holy city. And then it all collapsed because the city stopped growing. The people weren't moral enough for each other. They turned each other in. Businesses were not thriving. They couldn't attract new businesses. Excuse me. And finally, before the Reverend Stephen J. Harrison, one of the founders of the town, died, some of the town leaders said, Reverend, we need to allow a tavern to come into this town and to have a card room in the back. And the Reverend agreed. He understood. Morality isn't something you can enforce. Morality is something that changes. And from 1902 to 1929, things changed drastically. But it didn't change for everybody. In fact, I was president of the Ministerial Association in the early or the late 1990s, I guess it was, or early part of the new millennium, and several of the churches insisted on having a prayer gathering, that all the ministers and members of their church gather together and meet at a certain place, at a certain farm where a farmer had taken out apple orchards, red delicious, of which there was a market glut, and had planted wine grapes because there was a growing market for wine grapes. And the ministers wanted all of us to join them in praying against the evils of alcohol. I told them I could not in good conscience do that I drank wine, that I did not believe it was evil. The excess is what makes something bad, not the thing itself, and that farmers who can get a cash crop are far better off than farmers who are starving, putting out a crop that costs more to grow than it does produce for them. Now, let's think about this. Morality. What chapter are we in? We're still in the same chapter, and it's 19 in Genesis. Lot has escaped with his daughters. His wife turned back to see the destruction of Sodom and turned into a pillar of salt. His sons-in-law arrogantly refused to listen to the angel's warning and didn't leave the city, so they were destroyed. And Lot decided he wanted to settle in a smaller city, so he went to Zoar. But now, instead of going into Zoar, we hear this, starting in verse 30. Now Lot went up out of Zoar and settled in the hills with his 2 daughters, for he was afraid to stay in Zoar. So he lived in a cave with his 2 daughters. Why was he afraid to live in the town? An older man with 2 unmarried daughters? I don't know. Because of the exploitation and he had just offered these 2 daughters to men who wanted to have their way with the angels back in Sodom, part of why Sodom was destroyed, the immorality of Sodom, rape, exploitation, the ultimate lack of hospitality, violence against people, persecution of those who couldn't protect themselves. But Lot, it can't be out of fear for his daughters that he doesn't want to live in Zoar. The firstborn said to the younger, "Our father is old, and there's not a man on earth to come into us after the manner of all the world." I love the way they put that. There's not a man in the world to come into us after the manner of the world. It was their father's job to arrange husbands for them. They've already had husbands betrothed, but they hadn't yet had relations with them. They hadn't had any children. And part of their job as daughters is to marry men who will then carry on their father's name and the names of the men's fathers as well. Verse 32, "Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, so that we may preserve offspring through our father." So they made their father drink wine that night. They forced him to. He had no choice in the matter. "Father, you must drink this wine." Really? Come on. On the next day, the firstborn said to the younger, "Look, last night I lay with my father. Let us make him drink wine tonight. Then you also go in and lie with him, that we may preserve offspring through our father." So she made her father drink wine. Verse 36, "Thus both the daughters of Lot became pregnant by their father. The firstborn bore a son and named him Moab. He is the answer of the Moabites to this day. The younger also bore a son and named him Ben-Ami. He is the ancestor of the Ammonites to this day." And when we hear these stories, there's a couple of things we have to ask. What is the activity of God and of God's people? Well, we would call this incest today, and we would say that it's immoral, illegal, and scientifically unwise, likely to produce all sorts of genetic problems in generations to follow. Why is the story here, though? Is it because there's a moral thing? We could lift the moral thing out of here, but obviously that isn't the point of this story. There's no point at which they're saying, Oh, yep, incest is a bad thing. Rather, it produced two nations, the Moabites and the Ammonites. We've already heard about the Moabites and the Ammonites, which is curious. How can there be Moabites and the Ammonites already in the land, and Abraham has traveled with them and talked with them and fought with them and against them? And now the forerunners of these two clans, these two kingdoms, are now born of Lot and his daughters. And it says this is the origin of the Moabites and the Ammonites. And guess who is going to be cursed, and who is going to be destroyed, and whose land is going to be occupied by Abraham and his descendants along with the Canaanites. Remember the story of how Canaan, Noah's grandson, got cursed because of Noah's drunkenness. And now here Lot goes in and gets so drunk that he allows his daughters to have his way, and we have the Moabites and the Ammonites. And that now allows Israel centuries from now to say, see, they are born of evil. We have God's command, in fact, God's duty, to wipe them off the face of the earth, to justify genocide based on this story of illicit relations between Lot and his two daughters. Wow. This one didn't make the children's Bible either. What do we do with this? Yeah, morality. Always sticky. Always sticky. See you tomorrow.